Chapter 1. A world of lost. The village was unrecognizable. Ash hung in the air like a ghostly fog, settling over the charred remains of homes and fields. The acrid smell of smoke lingered, sharp and unrelenting, stinging Torian's nostrils with every breath. The once vibrant village square, where children had played and merchants had shouted their wares, was now a wasteland of broken beams and blackened stone. The silence pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the faint crackle of dying embers. Torian stood at the edge of the devastation, his boots sinking into the soot-covered ground. He clenched his fists at his sides, his dark eyes scanning the ruins of the place he had called home. This village had been his world, his shelter from the harshness beyond its borders. Now it was gone, reduced to ash and shadows. A cold wind swept through the square, carrying with it a bitter chill that stung his skin. Torian pulled his tattered cloak tighter around him, his movements slow and deliberate. He felt as though he were moving through a dream or a nightmare, where each step carried the weight of memories he could not bear to face. Yet he couldn't stop himself from moving forward. The path to his family's house was strewn with debris, shattered pottery, scorched tools, the remnants of what had once been lives full of meaning. Torian paused in front of what was left of his home, his chest tightening. The roof had caved in completely, the wooden beams twisted and broken. The walls, once painted in warm, earthy hues, were scorched black, their surfaces cracked and crumbling. He stepped over the threshold, his boots crunching on shards of glass and fragments of stone. This place, which had once been alive with the sound of his mother's singing and the scent of bread baking in the hearth, was now a tomb. The air inside was thick and oppressive, each breath heavy with ash and the faint, lingering scent of smoke. His gaze caught on a small pile of rubble near the hearth, and something within him stirred. He knelt, brushing aside the soot with trembling hands. Beneath the debris lay a small wooden carving, a wolf, its edges rough and unpolished. His father had made it for him years ago, carving it by firelight while Torian had watched with wide, eager eyes. He remembered clutching it in his hands during storms, imagining it as his protector. Torian gripped the carving tightly, his knuckles turning white. It was all that remained of his family, of the life he had known. His chest ached with the weight of it, the memories threatening to overwhelm him. He pressed the carving to his forehead, his eyes shut tight, as if the simple act could hold the pain at bay. But the memories came anyway, sharp and vivid, as if they were unfolding before him all over again. The attack had come without warning. It was dusk when the soldiers arrived, their black armor glinting in the fading sunlight. They marched into the village like a storm, their boots pounding against the cobblestones. The villagers had gathered in the square, their faces pale with fear, their breaths hushed and shallow. At the head of the soldiers stood a man clad in dark, imposing armor, his face hidden beneath a helmet etched with cruel designs. He spoke with a voice like grinding stone, his words cold and merciless. "By order of Lord Malvorn, your debts are due." Torian's father, Arel, had stepped forward, his broad shoulders squared and his voice steady. "We have nothing left to give," he said. "The taxes have taken everything." The man in the black armor didn't respond. He simply nodded to his soldiers, and they moved with brutal efficiency. Arel was dragged into the square, his protests drowned out by the cries of the villagers. Torian had stood frozen at the edge of the crowd, his heart pounding in his chest as he watched his father fight against his captors. "You cannot take more from us than you already have." Arel's voice rang out, defiant and strong. The soldiers silenced him with blows that echoed in the still evening air. Torian's mother screamed, her voice piercing as she lunged forward, only to be held back by the others. Torian wanted to run to his father's side, to fight alongside him, but his legs refused to move. He stood rooted to the spot, helpless as the soldiers beat his father to the ground. And then the fires began. The soldiers moved methodically, setting torches to the homes and shops, to the fields and the barns. The flames spread quickly, consuming everything in their path. The villagers fled in all directions, their cries mingling with the roar of the inferno. Torian had been dragged into the woods by one of the elders, his protests falling on deaf ears. He had watched from the shadows as his world burned, the heat of the flames searing his skin even from a distance. Now, as he stood amidst the ashes of what had been, Torian felt a deep, burning rage begin to rise within him. It was a cold fire, different from the heat of the flames that had destroyed his home. This fire was born of loss and grief, of anger and determination. He would not let this be the end. His father's voice echoed in his mind, a memory from long ago. Strength doesn't come from comfort, Torian. It comes from standing against what you think you cannot endure. He straightened, his grip tightening on the wolf carving. His gaze turned to the horizon, where the dense forest stretched endlessly, a shadowed unknown filled with dangers and mysteries. The wildlands were a place of legend, where creatures prowled and the unprepared were swallowed whole. It was a place for the strong or the desperate. Torian had nothing left but desperation. He searched the rubble for anything that could help him. Beneath a fallen beam, he found his father's dagger, its leather-wrapped hilt familiar in his hand. He strapped it to his belt, the weight of it a small comfort. A singed satchel yielded a handful of supplies, a pouch of dried meat, a battered waterskin, and a scrap of cloth he could use for bandages. It wasn't much, but it was enough. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the ruined village, Torian stood at its edge, his heart heavy with grief but his resolve unshakable. "This isn't the end," he whispered, the words carrying into the stillness. "It can't be." With one last glance at the ruins of his home, he turned and walked toward the wilderness. Each step felt heavier than the last, but he didn't stop. The shadows of the forest swallowed him, the ash of his past falling away with every stride. The road ahead would be long and treacherous, but he would endure. He would grow stronger, and one day he would return. And when he did, Malvorn would pay for everything he had taken. Chapter 2. Into the wilderness stretched before Torian like a labyrinth of shadows, vast and unrelenting. The towering trees rose like pillars into the sky, their canopy so dense that only slivers of light pierced through. The air was damp and heavy, rich with the scent of earth and moss, and the distant hum of unseen life filled the silence. It was a different kind of silence than the ruins of his village, a dangerous quiet, alive with hidden threats. He paused at the edge of the forest, his grip tightening on the dagger at his side. Behind him, the smoldering remains of his home were nothing more than a blackened stain on the horizon. His chest tightened at the thought of it, but he didn't let himself turn back. There was nothing left for him there. Only ash, only grief. The forest felt like a trial, a test set before him by the fates. He didn't know what lay ahead, but the weight in his chest told him he couldn't stop moving. He took his first step into the shadows, the sound of his boots crunching on the underbrush startling in the stillness. The first night was harder than he'd imagined. Torian found a shallow hollow beneath the roots of an ancient tree, its gnarled trunk twisted like the hand of some ancient giant. It wasn't much, but it offered shelter from the cold wind that swept through the forest, biting at his exposed skin. He draped his tattered cloak over himself, pressing his back against the rough bark. His stomach churned with hunger. The dried meat he rationed barely enough to take the edge off the ache. The forest came alive as the sun disappeared, the shadows shifting and deepening into black. Strange sounds filled the air, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, the occasional mournful cry of a distant animal. Every noise sent his hand darting to the dagger at his belt, his knuckles white with tension. His breath came in short, shallow bursts, his ears straining to hear the next sound. Sleep came in fits, if it came at all. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw his father's face, bruised, bloodied, and beaten to the ground. He saw the flames consuming his village, heard the screams echoing in the night. The guilt crushed him as heavily as the cold pressed against his chest. His father had stood and fought. Torian had hidden. The thought burned in his mind, turning his grief into a simmering anger. He gripped the wolf carving in his pocket, holding it tightly as if it could keep the memories at bay. But there was no escaping them. They haunted him as deeply as the wilderness surrounded him. By dawn, he was moving again. The days passed in a blur of exhaustion and hunger. Torian learned quickly that the wilderness was as much an adversary as a refuge. The forest was dense, the undergrowth clawing at his legs with every step. The streams he found were shallow and frigid, their icy waters stinging his throat, but offering momentary relief. His supplies dwindled, forcing him to forage for food. He scavenged what he could, berries, roots, even a few mushrooms he hoped wouldn't poison him. He discovered quickly that the forest was unforgiving. He set crude traps to catch small game, but the first few nights yielded nothing. He dug through the underbrush in search of edible plants, only to find most of them had already been stripped away by the animals that lived here. The wilderness did not make room for outsiders, and it certainly didn't care about his survival. But Torian refused to quit. His father's words came back to him in quiet moments, echoing in his mind. You don't learn strength by wishing for it, Torian. You learn it by moving forward, even when you're certain you can't. He moved forward, even when his legs burned from days of walking, even when his empty stomach twisted with hunger, even when his hands bled from gripping jagged rocks as he climbed over a ridge. Every step forward was a step away from the ruins of his village, from the failure that haunted him. On the 5th day, the wilderness struck back. Torian had just stumbled across a shallow stream, its water glinting in the faint light that filtered through the canopy. Relief flooded him as he knelt at its edge, cupping his hands to drink. The icy water burned his throat as he gulped it down, but he didn't care. He splashed it over his face, letting the chill wake him from the fog of exhaustion. He had just begun refilling his water skin when the ground gave way beneath him. He fell hard. The air knocked from his lungs as his body tumbled down a steep incline. Rocks and roots scraped against his skin, tearing his cloak and leaving his hands raw. He landed with a thud, pain radiating through his limbs. For a moment he lay still, staring up at the fractured light filtering through the trees above. His ears rang, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. He groaned, pushing himself onto his hands and knees, wincing as he moved. He was battered and bruised, but nothing felt broken. That was when he saw it. In the far corner of the pit lay a creature unlike anything Torian had ever seen. Its massive body was a strange, unnatural fusion of bat and wolverine. Thick, iron-like skin stretched over its sinewy frame, and its claws glinted like blades in the dim light. Its wings, though tattered, were clearly powerful, capable of lifting it high above the trees. But what struck Torian most were its eyes, glowing gold, sharp and intelligent, burning with pain and fury. The beast was trapped, its body bound tightly by thorny vines that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The vines coiled around its limbs and chest, digging deep into its flesh. Blood seeped from the wounds, dark and sluggish, staining the ground beneath it. The creature's chest heaved with shallow breaths, its golden eyes fixed on Torian with an intensity that froze him in place. Torian's hand went to the dagger at his belt, his fingers trembling. The beast was enormous, its sheer size and power enough to kill him with a single swipe of its claws. He could leave, scramble up the incline, and disappear into the forest. No one would blame him. No one would know. But as he looked into its eyes, something stirred inside him. It wasn't just a beast. It was a survivor like him, fighting against forces it couldn't control. He understood that desperation, that will to endure. He couldn't walk away. He gripped the dagger tightly and stepped forward. The work was grueling. Each vine he cut released a sharp hiss, sap oozing from the wound. The vines lashed out as if alive, their thorny tendrils raking across his arms and shoulders, leaving shallow cuts that stung like fire. Torian bit back cries of pain, his arms shaking with the effort of cutting through the thick, pulsing cords. The beast thrashed weakly, its wings twitching as the vines loosened, but it didn't attack. Its golden eyes stayed on him, filled with a mixture of fear and hope. Torian worked faster, ignoring the burning in his arms, the blood dripping from his hands. Finally, after what felt like hours, the last vine fell away. The beast let out a low, rumbling growl as it stretched its wings, testing its newfound freedom. Torian stumbled back, his chest heaving, his hands trembling. If the creature chose to attack him now, he wouldn't stand a chance. But the beast didn't move toward him. Instead, it lowered its massive head slightly, its golden eyes meeting his in what felt like an unspoken acknowledgement. Torian took a shaky breath. "You're free now," he said softly, though he wasn't sure why he spoke. The beast huffed, its breath warm against his face, and turned toward the forest. For a moment, Torian thought it would leave him, but then it stopped and looked back, as if waiting. Torian hesitated, then nodded. Together, they left the pit behind. Chapter 3. The unseen bond of the wilderness grew darker and more dangerous the further Torian ventured into its depths. The towering trees stretched endlessly, their thick canopy blocking out most of the sunlight. What little light filtered through was dim and cold, casting long shadows that seemed to move with the wind. Skarn, the beast he had freed, moved silently beside him. Its iron-like skin glinted faintly in the dappled light, its golden eyes scanning the forest with sharp awareness. Torian wasn't sure why the creature had chosen to stay with him, but he wasn't about to question it. Having Skarn at his side was both a comfort and a challenge. Torian tried to match the beast's pace, but his legs burned with every step. Hunger gnawed at him like a living thing, and his mind buzzed with exhaustion. His fingers traced a wolf carving in his pocket, his father's voice echoing faintly in his memory. Strength doesn't mean perfection, Torian. It means standing, even when you're weak. But weakness wasn't something Torian wanted to face. He hated how his hands trembled when he gripped his dagger, hated how fear gripped his chest every time a shadow shifted too suddenly, hated how much he relied on Skarn to make him feel safe. They came across a small clearing by mid-afternoon, the underbrush thinning to reveal a shallow stream trickling over smooth stones. The sound of water was a relief, cutting through the heavy quiet of the forest. Torian knelt at the stream's edge, cupping his hands to drink. The icy water stung his throat, but it was the best he'd tasted in days. Skarn approached the stream as well, lowering its massive head to drink. Torian watched the creature carefully, marveling at its raw power. The beast had been a savior in more ways than one. Its imposing presence alone had kept the predators of the forest at bay. But as much as he appreciated Skarn's company, it unsettled him too. The creature was wild, unpredictable. He couldn't shake the feeling that at any moment it might turn on him. "You're not exactly easy to read, are you?" Torian muttered, his voice breaking the silence. Skarn's ears flicked in his direction, but the beast didn't respond. Of course it didn't. He wasn't even sure why he'd spoken. Torian sighed, running a hand through his tangled hair. He felt foolish talking to a creature that likely didn't understand him. But there was no one else to talk to, and the silence had become unbearable. The peace didn't last. Torian was rinsing his hands in the stream when he noticed the forest had gone eerily quiet. The hum of insects, the rustling of leaves, even the distant bird calls, all of it had stopped. He froze, his hand hovering just above the water. His pulse quickened. Skarn stiffened, its golden eyes narrowing as it scanned the tree line. A low growl rumbled from its throat, deep and menacing. Torian's hand went instinctively to his dagger, though his fingers trembled as they closed around the hilt. The attack came without warning. From the shadows burst a pack of wolves, gaunt and wild, their patchy fur clinging to skeletal frames. Their eyes glowed faintly, a sickly yellow that made Torian's stomach twist. There were 5 of them, moving with unnatural coordination as they spread out to surround him and Skarn. Torian's heart thundered in his chest. He'd fought before, but never like this. These wolves weren't like the soldiers who had destroyed his village. They didn't hesitate. They didn't show mercy. Skarn was the first to act. The beast lunged at the nearest wolf, its claws slashing through the air with terrifying speed. The wolf yelped as Skarn's claws raked across its flank, sending it tumbling to the ground. But the others didn't falter. They surged forward, their snarls filling the clearing. Torian barely had time to react as one of the wolves lunged at him, its teeth snapping inches from his face. He stumbled back, nearly losing his footing on the slick stones of the stream. His dagger flashed as he swung wildly, the blade glancing off the wolf's shoulder. The creature snarled, its yellow eyes burning with hunger. Another wolf lunged, its jaws closing around his forearm. Pain flared as its teeth sank into his flesh, and Torian let out a cry. He drove the dagger into the wolf's side, twisting it with all his strength. The wolf let go, collapsing to the ground with a pained whimper. But there were more. Too many. Skarn fought like a storm unleashed. The beast's claws tore through the wolves with brutal efficiency, its roars shaking the trees. Yet even Skarn wasn't invincible. One wolf latched onto its hind leg, dragging it down. Another leapt onto its back, its teeth sinking into the tough, iron-like hide. Torian's vision blurred with pain and panic. He swung his dagger again and again, his movements fueled more by desperation than skill. His arm ached, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. He could feel himself slowing, faltering. He wasn't strong enough for this. No! The thought burned through his mind, hot and sharp. You didn't get to fail again. Heat surged in his chest, sudden and overwhelming. His hands tingled, the sensation spreading up his arms like fire. It was the same feeling he'd had before, the strange, untamed energy that coursed through him in moments of desperation. As another wolf lunged at him, Torian swung his fist instead of his blade. A burst of energy erupted from his knuckles, slamming into the wolf midair. The creature yelped as it was thrown backward, crashing into the underbrush. The clearing fell silent. The remaining wolves hesitated, their glowing eyes darting between Torian and Skarn. Slowly, they backed away, retreating into the shadows one by one. Within moments, they were gone. Torian stood trembling, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. His hands still tingled, faint wisps of heat curling from his fingertips. He stared at them, his mind racing. What had he just done? A low rumble brought him back to the present. Skarn limped toward him, its golden eyes steady despite the blood dripping from its wounds. The beast sank onto its haunches, exhaustion evident in the way its massive frame sagged. Torian dropped to his knees beside it, his hands hovering uncertainly. "You're hurt," he said softly, his voice hoarse. Skarn huffed, as if to dismiss the notion, but Torian didn't let it slide. He tore a strip of cloth from his cloak and pressed it against the gash on the beast's leg, tying it tightly to stem the bleeding. "Don't make me regret helping you," he muttered, though there was no real anger in his voice. Skarn's eyes flicked to his, and for a moment, Torian thought he saw something there, an understanding, perhaps, or gratitude. That night, they camped by the stream, the firelight casting flickering shadows on the trees. Torian sat with his back against a rock, the wolf carving in his hands. His fingers traced its worn edges as his mind replayed the events of the day. The wolves, the energy, the fear. He looked at Skarn, who lay curled beside the fire, its golden eyes half closed. The beast had saved him, and he had saved it. Whatever this bond was between them, it was growing. Torian wasn't sure if it was trust or necessity, but for the first time in days, he didn't feel completely alone. "Guess we're stuck with each other," he murmured. Skarn didn't respond, but its ears flicked in his direction. Torian leaned back, his grip on the carving loosening. He was weak, flawed, scared, but he was still here. And as long as he was here, he would keep moving forward. Chapter 4. The watcher in the shadows, the forest grew colder as Torian and Skarn ventured deeper into its heart. The trees seemed to loom taller here, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. A mist hung low to the ground, swirling around their feet with every step. The sun barely pierced the dense canopy above, and even at midday, the world was painted in shades of gray. Torian pulled his cloak tighter around his shoulders, his breath fogging in the chill air. He glanced at Skarn, whose golden eyes scanned the surroundings with sharp vigilance. The beast moved with practiced ease, its claws clicking softly against the rocky terrain. Despite its injuries from the fight with the wolves, Skarn showed no signs of slowing. Torian wished he could say the same for himself. His body ached from days of walking, his muscles stiff and unresponsive. The gash on his arm throbbed with every step, a dull reminder of how close he had come to death. He had wrapped it as best he could with the scraps of his cloak, but the improvised bandage did little to ease the pain. Still, he pressed on. He didn't have a choice. By late afternoon, the forest began to change. The trees were spaced farther apart, their roots twisting over rocky ground that jutted sharply from the earth. The mist thickened, clinging to Torian's legs and obscuring the path ahead. It felt unnatural, as though the forest itself were trying to drive them back. "I don't like this," Torian muttered under his breath, his hand resting on the hilt of his dagger. His voice sounded hollow in the heavy stillness. Skarn rumbled softly, a low growl that sent a shiver down Torian's spine. The beast's ears twitched, its head snapping toward a cluster of boulders to their right. Torian followed its gaze, his heart pounding. The forest was silent, too silent. Torian's fingers tightened around his dagger as he stepped closer to Skarn, his eyes darting through the mist. The trees seemed to shift and blur at the edges of his vision, their twisted shapes melting into shadows. He took a shaky breath, trying to steady himself. "We're not alone," he whispered. The attack came without warning. From the mist emerged a figure that shimmered like liquid light, its form barely human. Its body was translucent, the edges of its limbs blurring into the air around it. Its eyes glowed faintly, twin orbs of silver that pierced through the gloom. Torian stumbled back, his dagger drawn. Skarn roared, placing itself between him and the figure, its claws digging into the ground. The figure didn't speak, but its voice filled Torian's mind like the deep toll of a bell. "You seek strength, yet you carry only weakness. What are you?" Torian's mouth went dry. He tried to respond, but the words caught in his throat. The figure tilted its head, its gaze sharp and unyielding. "You are unworthy," it said, and with a sudden burst of speed, it lunged. Skarn intercepted the attack, its massive body colliding with the figure. The two clashed in a blur of motion, the sound of claws against light echoing through the clearing. Torian barely had time to react before another figure emerged from the mist, a second shimmering form, identical to the first. The second figure moved toward him, its steps unnaturally smooth. Torian swung his dagger, but the blade passed through the figure as though it were made of smoke. A sharp, burning pain erupted in his chest as the figure's hand struck him, sending him sprawling to the ground. He gasped. The air knocked from his lungs. The heat surged through him again, the same untamed energy that had saved him before, but this time it was weaker, harder to summon. His hands tingled faintly, but no power came. "I don't understand," he shouted, frustration and fear boiling over. The figure loomed above him, its glowing eyes cold and unfeeling. "You will fail as you always have," it said, raising its arm for another strike. Torian's frustration turned to rage. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. The pain in his chest burned hotter, the energy surging weakly as though struggling to break free. He gritted his teeth, his mind racing. He had to focus, to control it. He couldn't let the fear win. The figure struck, its hand descending like a blade. But Torian rolled to the side, his body moving on instinct. He swung his dagger in desperation, and this time the energy flared to life. A burst of light erupted from the blade, slamming into the figure and sending it skidding back. The forest fell silent once more. The figure stood still for a moment, its silver eyes narrowing. "You are awakening," it said, its voice a low hum in his mind. But you are not ready. With those words, the figure dissolved into the mist, its form fading like smoke on the wind. Skarn growled softly, drawing Torian's attention. The beast stood over the remains of the first figure, its claws stained with a faint, shimmering light. It limped toward him, its golden eyes filled with concern. Torian let out a shaky breath, his hands trembling as he lowered the dagger. "What was that?" he muttered, his voice barely audible. Skarn didn't answer, of course. The beast simply stood beside him, its massive frame steady and reassuring. Torian pushed himself to his feet, wincing as his injuries protested. He looked around the clearing, his heart still pounding. The mist was thinner now, the oppressive stillness lifting slightly. "We need to keep moving," he said, though he wasn't sure who he was talking to, Skarn or himself. His legs felt like lead, his body heavy with exhaustion, but he forced himself forward. Whatever those creatures were, he didn't want to meet them again. That night, Torian sat by a small fire, the dagger resting in his lap. His fingers traced its worn hilt, his thoughts racing. The energy he had summoned, it had felt powerful, wild, but also uncontrollable. It frightened him. What if he couldn't use it when it mattered? What if it failed him again? He looked at Skarn, who lay curled beside the fire, its breathing slow and steady. The beast's presence was a comfort, but it wasn't enough to silence the doubts creeping into his mind. "You think I'm weak too, don't you?" he murmured, his voice bitter. Skarn didn't respond, its golden eyes closed. Torian clenched his fists. He hated feeling like this, helpless, uncertain. He had left his village to find strength, to survive. But every step forward seemed to reveal just how far he had to go. He stared into the flames, his jaw tightening. He couldn't let himself fail again. He wouldn't. Chapter 5. The black gorilla's wrath the forest grew quieter as Torian and Skarn descended into a valley shrouded in mist. The trees here were different, older, larger, their roots tangled and clawing through the soil like ancient veins. The air was heavy, filled with the damp chill of the earth and the faint, metallic scent of something unnatural. Torian tightened his grip on the dagger at his side, its leather hilt rough against his palm. Skarn padded silently beside him, its golden eyes scanning the shadowed landscape. The beast's presence had become a comfort, but Torian couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves sent his heart racing, his mind imagining unseen threats lurking in the dark. "You feel it too, don't you?" Torian whispered, glancing at Skarn. The beast huffed softly, its ears twitching forward. That was all the confirmation Torian needed. They weren't alone. The ground sloped sharply as they pressed deeper into the valley, the mist thickening with each step. The trees grew farther apart, giving way to jagged boulders and patches of brittle grass. Torian's boots slipped on the damp stones, his muscles aching from days of travel. His stomach growled, a painful reminder of how little he had eaten. He paused to catch his breath, leaning against a tree. "We need to find food," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Or shelter. Or both." Skarn didn't respond. The beast stood motionless, its body tense, its gaze fixed on something ahead. Torian followed its line of sight, his breath catching in his throat. There, in the heart of the valley, stood a creature that dwarfed even Skarn. The beast was massive, its jet black fur rippling over muscle and sinew. Its arms were thick as tree trunks, its chest marked with a strange, glowing sigil that pulsed faintly in the gloom. A gorilla, but larger than any Torian had ever imagined. Its sheer size seemed to dwarf the trees around it. Its deep, red eyes glinted like embers, filled with a predatory intelligence. Torian's hand instinctively moved to the wolf carving in his pocket, his fingers gripping it tightly. His pulse pounded in his ears as he stared at the creature, frozen in place. Skarn let out a low growl, its claws digging into the ground as it crouched, ready to strike. The gorilla turned slowly, its heavy footfalls shaking the ground. When its gaze landed on them, Torian felt the weight of its presence like a physical blow. It bared its teeth, a low rumble emanating from its chest, and pounded its fists against the ground with a force that sent tremors through the earth. "Skarn, I don't think we should." Before Torian could finish, the gorilla charged. The beast moved faster than seemed possible for its size. Skarn met the charge head-on, leaping forward with a roar that echoed through the valley. The two collided with a deafening crash, claws and fists striking in a blur of motion. Torian stumbled back, nearly losing his footing as the ground shook beneath him. The gorilla swung its massive arm, its fist catching Skarn in the side and sending the beast sprawling into a cluster of rocks. Skarn recovered quickly, its claws flashing as it slashed at the gorilla's chest. The glowing sigil flared brightly, absorbing the blow with a burst of energy that sent Skarn skidding back once more. Torian watched in horror, his dagger useless in his hand. He wanted to help, but the sheer scale of the fight left him paralyzed. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to put as much distance between himself and the battle as possible. But Skarn was fighting for him. He couldn't abandon the beast now. He forced himself to move, his legs trembling as he scrambled onto a boulder for a better vantage point. "Come on, think," he muttered, his mind racing. The sigil, it had to be the key. If the gorilla's strength came from that glowing mark, then maybe the gorilla roared, the sound vibrating in Torian's chest, and turned its attention to him. Torian froze as the creature charged, its heavy footfalls shaking the ground. He barely had time to leap from the boulder before the gorilla's fist slammed into it, shattering the stone into jagged shards. He rolled to his feet, his heart hammering as he scrambled for cover. "Skarn!" he shouted, panic lacing his voice. The beast lunged at the gorilla, its claws raking across the glowing sigil. The gorilla roared in pain, the light flickering for a brief moment before flaring brighter. It swung its arm, catching Skarn in the side and sending it crashing into the ground. Torian's mind raced. The energy, the strange power he had felt during the fight with the wolves, it had to work here too. But how could he summon it? He clutched the dagger tightly, his knuckles white. The heat stirred faintly in his chest, weak and unsteady, like a flickering flame. The gorilla turned toward him again, its red eyes blazing. Torian backed away, his breaths coming in shallow gasps. He could feel the energy building, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. The gorilla charged. Come on, Torian muttered, his voice shaking. The energy surged, stronger this time, and his hand tingled with heat. As the gorilla closed the distance, Torian swung his dagger with all his strength. A burst of light erupted from the blade, striking the sigil squarely in the chest. The gorilla roared, staggering back as the sigil cracked and flickered. The light dimmed, its glow fading into nothing. The creature swayed for a moment before collapsing to the ground, the earth shaking beneath its massive weight. The silence that followed was deafening. Torian stood frozen, his chest heaving, his dagger still glowing faintly in his hand. Skarn limped toward him, blood matting its dark hide, but its golden eyes were steady. Torian knelt beside the beast, his hands trembling as he inspected its injuries. "You're tougher than you look," he said softly, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Skarn rumbled in response, its breath warm against his face. He leaned back, his exhaustion catching up with him. His arm throbbed where the wolf had bitten him days ago, and his legs felt like they might give out at any moment. But he was alive. They both were. As the mist began to clear, Torian looked down at the dagger in his hand. The energy was gone now, the blade cool and ordinary once more, but the memory of its power lingered, a strange mix of fear and wonder. "Looks like we're not done yet," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. Skarn huffed in agreement, its golden eyes glinting in the fading light. Together, they left the valley behind, the shadow of the black gorilla fading into the mist. Chapter 6. Whispers in the wild of forest had a way of swallowing sound, turning even the loudest moments into echoes that faded too quickly. Torian walked in silence, the only noise coming from the crunch of his boots on the undergrowth and the faint rasp of his breath. Skarn padded beside him, its golden eyes constantly scanning the trees, its ears twitching at every distant noise. The encounter with the black gorilla still weighed heavily on Torian's mind. His body ached from the battle, but it wasn't the bruises or the fatigue that bothered him. It was the power he had unleashed. That strange, uncontrollable energy. It had saved him, but it had also scared him. He hadn't been in control, not really. "You're quiet today," Torian muttered, his voice breaking the stillness. He glanced at Skarn, the corner of his mouth tugging into a weak smile. "Not that you're much of a conversationalist on the best of days." Skarn snorted, a sound that almost resembled laughter, and Torian chuckled despite himself. "I'll take that as agreement," he said, brushing a hand through his tangled hair. His smile faded as his gaze returned to the path ahead. The forest seemed darker here, the trees closer together, their branches forming an almost impenetrable canopy. He felt like he was being watched. They stopped by a stream to rest, the sound of rushing water a welcome break from the eerie silence. Torian knelt at the edge, splashing his face with the icy liquid. His reflection stared back at him, his features sharper and more worn than he remembered. The boy who had lived in the village was gone. What stared back at him now was someone harder, someone who had seen too much in too short a time. "You think I'm ready for this?" he asked aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. He wasn't sure if he was talking to himself or to Skarn, who stood a few paces away, drinking from the stream. The beast lifted its head, water dripping from its muzzle, and fixed him with a steady gaze. It didn't answer, of course, it couldn't, but the look in its eyes was enough. Skarn seemed to believe in him, even if he couldn't quite believe in himself. "I'll take that as a yes," Torian said with a faint smile, though doubt still gnawed at the edges of his mind. As he stood, shaking the water from his hands, the forest fell silent again. The rushing stream seemed muted, the air heavy with an unnatural stillness. Skarn stiffened, its ears flattening against its head. Torian's hand went to his dagger instinctively, the leather-wrapped hilt warm and familiar beneath his fingers. The whisper came softly at first, barely audible over the faint breeze. "Torian," he froze, his pulse pounding in his ears. The voice was faint, ghostly, but unmistakable. It wasn't the deep, resonant voice of the shimmering figure from before. This voice was softer, almost melodic, but it sent a chill down his spine nonetheless. "Did you hear that?" he asked, glancing at Skarn. The beast growled low in its throat, its golden eyes narrowing as it scanned the forest. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Torian." The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, its tone equal parts inviting and unsettling. Torian gritted his teeth, his hand tightening around his dagger. "Show yourself," he shouted, his voice echoing through the trees. The forest responded with silence. Skarn stepped closer to him, its massive frame tense and ready to strike. Torian's eyes darted through the shadows, searching for movement, for any sign of what was stalking them. He hated this, being on edge, being hunted. It reminded him too much of the night his village had burned. The whisper came again, closer now, and Torian could feel the hairs on the back of his neck rise. "Torian, why do you run?" "I'm not running," he snapped, his voice sharper than he intended. His own words surprised him. Wasn't he running? Running from his village, from his grief, from the weight of his father's last stand? The whisper didn't respond. Instead, the shadows shifted, and a figure emerged from the trees. The figure was unlike anything Torian had ever seen. It was tall and slender, its body cloaked in flowing fabric that shimmered like moonlight. Its face was hidden behind a smooth, featureless mask, and its hands were long and delicate, each finger ending in a sharp, glinting claw. The figure moved with an unnatural grace, its steps barely disturbing the ground beneath it. Skarn growled, stepping in front of Torian, its claws digging into the earth. Torian raised his dagger, his pulse racing. Who are you? He demanded, his voice trembling despite his effort to sound steady. The figure tilted its head, its mask catching the faint light. When it spoke, its voice was the same whisper that had called to him, soft and haunting. I am a watcher, nothing more. And yet you intrigue me. Torian swallowed hard, his grip tightening on the dagger. Why are you following me? He asked, his voice firmer now. The watcher didn't answer right away. Instead, it raised a hand, pointing toward him with one of its clawed fingers. There is a fire in you, Torian, a fire you do not yet understand. It burns brighter than most, but it is fragile. I don't know what you're talking about, Torian said, though his chest tightened at the words. He thought of the energy that had erupted from him, the uncontrollable force that had saved him more than once. He didn't understand it, but the Watcher's words hit too close to the truth. The Watcher took a step closer, and Skarn growled louder, its hackles rising. The beast's warning didn't seem to faze the figure. You will need that fire, it said, its voice low and deliberate. But beware, flames can protect, or they can destroy. Which will yours be? Torian's jaw clenched. I don't need riddles, he said, his voice sharp. If you have something to say, say it. The Watcher tilted its head again, as if amused. You are impatient. Another flaw to overcome. But time will teach you, if you survive. It lowered its hand, its form beginning to blur at the edges. We will meet again, Torian, and when we do, I hope you are ready. Before Torian could respond, the figure dissolved into the shadows, leaving behind only the faintest shimmer of light. The forest was silent once more. Torian let out a shaky breath, lowering his dagger. His hands trembled as the adrenaline ebbed, leaving behind exhaustion and unease. Skarn stepped closer to him, its golden eyes watching him carefully. Well, that wasn't unsettling at all, Torian muttered, though his attempt at humor fell flat. He sheathed his dagger, his mind racing with questions. Who, or what, was the Watcher? What did it mean about his fire? Skarn rumbled softly, nudging his arm with its massive head. Torian managed a weak smile, running a hand over the beast's iron-like skin. Thanks, he said quietly, for having my back. Skarn huffed in response, and Torian sighed, his gaze shifting to the path ahead. The Watcher's words lingered in his mind, an unwelcome echo. Flames could protect, or they could destroy. Which would his be? He didn't know, but he intended to find out. Chapter 7. Shadows and sparks, the wilderness stretched out in all directions, endless and unrelenting. Every step Torian took felt heavier, as if the forest itself were trying to drag him down. His limbs were sore, his stomach hollow, and his thoughts churned like a storm cloud. The Watcher's cryptic words echoed in his mind. Flames can protect, or they can destroy. Which will yours be? Torian glanced at Skarn, who moved with steady purpose beside him. The beast's wounds from the fight with the black gorilla were healing, but its movements were slower than usual, its golden eyes dimmer. Torian felt a pang of guilt. Skarn had endured so much already, and yet it stayed by his side. For reasons he couldn't fully understand, the beast trusted him. Hey! Torian said, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. He didn't look at Skarn as he spoke, his eyes fixed on the rocky trail ahead. Do you think I'm wasting your time, dragging you into all this for nothing? Skarn didn't answer, of course, but it made a noise somewhere between a growl and a snort. Torian smirked weakly. Yeah, I know. Dumb question. He sighed, gripping the wolf carving in his pocket. It's just, I don't know what I'm doing out here. Every step forward feels like I'm just running from what happened, running from Malvorn, from... His voice broke off, his throat tightening. Skarn let out a low rumble, nudging his shoulder with its massive head. The gesture was oddly comforting, and Torian let out a shaky breath. Thanks, he muttered. Not much of a pep talk, but I'll take it. By midday, the forest began to thin. The towering trees gave way to rolling hills dotted with jagged boulders, their surfaces worn smooth by time and weather. Torian squinted against the harsh sunlight, a sharp contrast to the cool shadows of the forest. The heat pressed down on him, beads of sweat forming on his brow. He stopped at the crest of a hill, his breath catching as he looked out over the expanse below. A wide river snaked through the valley, its waters glittering like molten silver. Beyond it, the land rose into jagged cliffs that seemed to pierce the sky. But it wasn't the landscape that held his attention. It was the ruins, nestled at the base of the cliffs, partially hidden by overgrown vegetation, were the crumbling remains of a village. Stone walls jutted from the ground like broken teeth, their surfaces scarred by time and battle. The roofs of the buildings were long gone, their frames reduced to splintered beams and piles of rubble. Torian felt a pang of familiarity as he looked at the ruins, an eerie echo of his own village. "Another graveyard," he murmured, his voice heavy. Skarn growled softly, its gaze fixed on the ruins. Torian hesitated. The sight of the ruins stirred something in him. Curiosity, but also dread. The Watcher's warning lingered in his mind, and a part of him wanted to turn away, to keep moving and leave this place behind. But he couldn't. Not yet. "Let's check it out," he said, starting down the hill. His legs ached with every step, but his resolve pushed him forward. The air grew heavier as they approached the ruins, the heat of the day giving way to a strange, oppressive chill. Torian's footsteps echoed against the cracked stone as he entered what had once been a village square. Weeds pushed through the cobblestones, their roots curling around rusted weapons and broken pottery. The faint smell of decay lingered in the air, sharp and acrid. Skarn moved ahead, its claws clicking softly on the stone. Torian followed, his hand resting on the hilt of his dagger. He felt exposed here, surrounded by the ghosts of the past. His eyes darted from shadow to shadow, every movement in the corner of his vision setting his nerves on edge. "Something happened here," Torian said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. He knelt beside a rusted sword half buried in the ground, his fingers tracing the intricate designs etched into its hilt. It was beautiful, even in its ruined state. Skarn growled suddenly, its golden eyes fixed on a nearby building. Torian stood quickly, his heart pounding. The structure was little more than a shell, its walls pockmarked with holes, and its roof collapsed inward. But as Torian stepped closer, he saw it, a faint flicker of movement inside. "Hello?" he called out, his voice steady despite the fear coiling in his chest. The shadows inside the building didn't respond. He drew his dagger, the blade glinting in the fading light, and stepped through the crumbling doorway. The air inside was cool and damp, the smell of mildew clinging to the walls. His eyes adjusted slowly to the dimness, and as they did, he froze. The figure was hunched in the corner, its back turned to him. Its body was thin and twisted, wrapped in tattered cloth that hung loosely from its frame. Long, gnarled fingers scraped against the stone floor, leaving faint grooves in the surface. Torian's breath caught in his throat. "Who?" he began, but the figure turned before he could finish. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a hollow mask of shadow, its features shifting and swirling like smoke caught in a breeze. Its eyes were empty sockets, yet Torian felt them boring into him, piercing through his defenses. The figure's mouth opened, and a voice spilled out, a chorus of whispers layered and haunting. "You should not be here." Torian stumbled back, his dagger trembling in his hand. What are you?" he demanded, his voice breaking. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it rose to its full height, its limbs impossibly long and thin. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became a deafening roar in Torian's mind. He clutched his head, his knees buckling under the weight of the sound. Skarn roared from the doorway, leaping between Torian and the figure. The beast's claws slashed through the air, but they passed through the figure's shadowy form without resistance. The figure tilted its head as if amused and raised one long, clawed finger. A wave of dark energy erupted from its hand, slamming into Skarn and sending the beast crashing into the wall. Torian screamed, the sound tearing from his throat as he lunged forward, his dagger glowing faintly in his hand. The energy surged in his chest, stronger than before, and he swung with all his might. The blade connected, and the figure let out a shriek that reverberated through the ruins. Its form flickered, the shadows unraveling like threads of smoke. Torian didn't stop. He struck again and again, each blow fueled by a mix of fear and rage, until the figure dissolved entirely, leaving only silence in its wake. Torian collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving. The dagger fell from his hand, clattering against the stone floor. Skarn limped toward him, blood matting its fur, but its eyes were steady. "We need to leave," Torian said, his voice raw. He forced himself to his feet, his legs shaking beneath him. Whatever that thing was, there might be more. Skarn growled softly, as if in agreement, and together they left the ruins behind. As they climbed the hill leading away from the village, Torian glanced back one last time. The shadows seemed deeper now, the ruins more hollow. He tightened his grip on the wolf carving, his jaw set. He didn't know what the figure had been, but he knew one thing for certain. The wilderness wasn't just testing him, it was watching. Chapter 8. Echoes of the past of forest swallowed them once more, the shadows of the trees closing in like a living thing. The sun had dipped low on the horizon, casting the world in hues of orange and red. But even the fading light couldn't warm the chill that lingered in Torian's chest. The ruins of the abandoned village had stirred something in him, a gnawing unease that refused to fade. Skarn moved beside him, its massive frame silent except for the faint sound of its claws against the forest floor. The beast's golden eyes flicked toward him occasionally, as if sensing his thoughts. Torian caught one of those glances and shook his head. "I know," he muttered, gripping the wolf carving in his pocket. "I don't like it either." Skarn huffed softly, a sound that Torian had come to associate with quiet agreement. He managed a faint smile, though it quickly faded as his gaze shifted back to the darkening path ahead. The forest grew quieter as the sun disappeared, the last traces of light swallowed by the thick canopy overhead. Torian stopped to make camp, choosing a small clearing where the trees arched like sentinels around them. He built a fire, the crackling flames offering a fragile barrier against the encroaching shadows. As the firelight flickered, Torian sat with his back against a tree, the dagger resting on his lap. His body ached from the day's journey, his muscles stiff and unresponsive, but his mind refused to settle. The figure in the ruins had been unlike anything he'd ever seen, a shadow given form, its whispers still echoing faintly in his thoughts. "You should not be here." The words felt like a warning, though of what he couldn't say. He clenched his fists, frustration bubbling to the surface. Every step forward seemed to lead to more questions, more mysteries he couldn't unravel. Skarn lay curled beside the fire, its breathing slow and steady. Torian glanced at the beast, his voice quiet as he said, "You know, for all the danger, I thought there'd be answers somewhere, but all I've got is more things to worry about." Skarn's ear flicked in his direction, but the beast didn't move. Torian sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Maybe I'm just not asking the right questions," he muttered. The night deepened, and with it came the dreams. Torian found himself back in his village, the air thick with the scent of smoke and burning wood. The sky was a deep, angry red, the flames devouring the buildings around him. He heard the cries of the villagers, the shouts of soldiers, the crackle of fire, all of it crashing over him like a wave. He saw his father in the square, his broad shoulders hunched but unbroken, his voice steady even as the soldiers surrounded him. "Strength isn't in how tall you stand, Torian," his father said, though his lips didn't move. "It's in how hard you fight to keep standing." Torian tried to run to him, but the ground shifted beneath his feet, dragging him away. The flames roared higher, swallowing his father's figure until there was nothing left but ash. He woke with a start, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The fire had burned low, its embers glowing faintly in the dark. Skarn lifted its head, its golden eyes watching him closely. "It's nothing," Torian said, though his voice was hoarse. He rubbed his eyes, his hands trembling slightly. "Just a dream." Skarn didn't seem convinced, but it lowered its head again, its body relaxing slightly. Torian leaned back against the tree, staring at the dying fire. The wolf carving was still in his hand, its edges digging into his palm. He loosened his grip, exhaling slowly. The dream had felt too real. His father's words echoed in his mind, a reminder of everything he was trying to live up to, and everything he was afraid he couldn't. "I don't know if I can do this," he admitted softly, the words slipping out before he could stop them. The morning came slowly, the light filtering through the trees in pale, watery rays. Torian packed his belongings in silence, his movements mechanical. He felt drained, the weight of the dream pressing heavily on him. Skarn waited patiently, its golden eyes fixed on him as he worked. When they set out again, the forest felt different. The air was colder, the shadows deeper, and the path seemed narrower, as though the wilderness itself had shifted. Torian gripped the dagger tightly, his gaze flicking toward every rustle in the underbrush. By midday, the path led them to a rocky outcrop overlooking a wide valley. Torian paused, the sight stealing his breath. The valley was vast, its rolling hills covered in a patchwork of green and gold. A river wound through the center, its waters sparkling in the sunlight. But it was the ruins in the distance that caught his attention. They were smaller than the village he had seen before, little more than the remains of a single building. The structure was half buried in the earth, its stone walls cracked and weathered. Yet something about it drew him in, an almost magnetic pull. "What do you think?" Torian asked, glancing at Skarn. The beast didn't respond, but its ears twitched, its golden eyes narrowing slightly. Torian took a deep breath. "Yeah, I know, but we have to check it out." The descent into the valley was slow and treacherous, the rocky path crumbling beneath their feet. By the time they reached the ruins, the sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. Torian stepped cautiously over the threshold, the air inside cool and damp. The walls were covered in strange carvings, their surfaces worn smooth in places but still legible. Torian ran his fingers over the symbols, their meaning just out of reach. They felt old, older than the ruins of his village, older than the watcher in the woods. "What is this place?" he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Skarn growled softly, its body tense as it moved through the room. Torian followed, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The carvings continued along the walls, telling a story he couldn't quite piece together. At the far end of the room, something glinted in the fading light. Torian approached cautiously, his hand resting on the hilt of his dagger. It was a pedestal, and atop it sat a small crystal, its surface swirling with faint light. He reached out, his fingers hovering just above the crystal. It seemed to pulse faintly, as though alive. "You shouldn't touch that." The voice made him freeze. Torian spun around, his dagger drawn, but the room was empty. The shadows seemed to shift and ripple, and for a moment, he thought he saw the faint outline of a figure. The whisper came again, soft and cold. "Not yet, Torian." The crystal dimmed, its light fading into darkness. Torian stood frozen, his pulse racing, as the room grew eerily silent once more. Chapter 9. A path unveiled, the ruins lay behind them, the strange whispers and the dimming crystal lingering in Torian's thoughts like a splinter. The forest was quieter now, the usual rustle of leaves and distant bird calls replaced by an unnatural stillness. Even Skarn seemed uneasy, its ears constantly twitching as its golden eyes scanned the shadows. Torian adjusted the strap of his satchel, his dagger at the ready. His mind churned with questions about the ruins, the watcher, the voice, and the crystal that had pulsed with an energy he couldn't quite understand. It was as if the wilderness itself were testing him, revealing only fragments of a puzzle he had no way to solve. "You ever feel like we're just fumbling around out here?" he asked, glancing at Skarn. The beast didn't respond, but its low growl was enough to make Torian smile faintly. "Yeah, me too." They walked in silence for a time, the path winding through thick clusters of trees and over uneven ground. The sunlight barely reached them here,